Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Sharon Bown, and joining us this evening from the Royal Australian Navy is Captain Lisa Batchelor. Today marks the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Kapyong, one of the most significant actions fought during the Korean War. The battle saw the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, including the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RAR, defeat a Chinese division that was surging through the Kapyong Valley, threatening the South Korean capital, Seoul. Toward the end of April 1951, Australian troops were resting near the village of Kapyong, preparing to host New Zealand, British and Turkish comrades for Anzac Day. On the evening of the 22nd of April, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army launched its spring offensive, smashing into the 6th Republic of Korea Division at the head of the Kapyong Valley. The South Koreans were quickly overwhelmed and forced to retreat. Next morning, the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade was ordered to prepare defences north of the village. That evening, 3 RAR occupied high ground on the right of the valley, while Canadians of the 1st Battalion, Princess Patricia's Light Infantry, occupied the hills on the left. In support was the 1st Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment, 16th Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery, and Company A of the US Army's 72nd Tank Battalion. Throughout the evening of the 23rd of April, Chinese troops flooded into the valley. Hard fighting continued throughout the night. Australian posts were overrun, then retaken. But by the following evening, 3 RAR had to stage a fighting withdrawal. As the Australians broke contact, the Chinese turned their attention to the Canadians who held their ground, supported by the New Zealand artillery and US tanks. By morning on the 25th of April, the Chinese attack was spent and the threat to Seoul had subsided. The battle had been costly. The Australians suffered 32 men killed, 53 wounded, and 3 were taken prisoner of war. One of the prisoners, Private Slim Madden, was later posthumously awarded a George Cross for his selfless courage in the face of his captors. The Canadians suffered 10 killed and 23 wounded. The American tankers suffered 3 killed, 12 wounded, and lost 2 tanks, while the New Zealanders suffered 2 killed and 1 wounded. The Australians, Canadians and Americans were awarded the US Presidential Distinguished Unit Citation, the New Zealanders the South Korean Presidential Unit Citation. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson, who commanded 3 RAR during the battle, was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. On this, the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Kapyong, we are honoured to acknowledge His Excellency, Mr. Jung Shik Kung, Ambassador of Republic of Korea to Australia, Mr. Cole Berryman, Korean War veteran, and current serving and veteran members of 3 RAR. We are also honoured to acknowledge His Excellency, Mr. Michał Kowalczyk, Ambassador of Poland to Australia, Mr. Lukasz Graben, First Secretary of the Polish Embassy, and the Katyn Smolensk Rally and Polish Ex-Servicemen's Association delegations. We also warmly welcome representatives of the Defence LGBTI Information Service and Mr. Alan George, representing the Air Force Association. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. If you are able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catafalque party, attention. Catafalque party presents arms.
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is girt by sea. Our land
Those requiring a seat, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Private Harold Bolitho. Harold Bolitho was born on the 1st of May 1924 in St Kilda, Victoria, the son of Ernest and Margaret Bolitho. Ernest had served on the Western Front during the First World War and returned to Australia before going to work in the Bullara butter factory. By the early 1930s, he had taken over the business. Harold Bolitho attended Bullara Public School and then Caulfield Grammar School. After leaving school, he went to work as a tester in his father's factory. When the factory closed, the family moved to Surrey Hills in Melbourne's eastern suburbs. Following the outbreak of the Second World War, Harold served for a short time in a militia unit. On his 19th birthday, the 1st of May 1943, he enlisted for service in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force. He qualified as a signaller and saw service in the Northern Territory. He ended the war as a crewman on board the Australian Army ship Crusader. The vessel was launched towards the end of the war and was involved in transporting military vehicles, equipment and supplies to Lae, Rabaul, Torokina and Atapi. He was discharged in December of 1946 and returned home. On the 25th of June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, and the Korean War began. In late July, the Australian government announced that the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RAR, would be committed to the war. Firstly, however, the battalion, which was stationed in Japan, needed to be brought up to strength. In early August, the government called for 1,000 volunteers, with a preference for men who had served during the Second World War. The scheme, known as K-Force, called for the men to serve for 3 years in the army, with one of those years being service in Korea. Bolitho enlisted on the 29th of August, and after a brief period of training was sent to Japan, arriving on the 8th of January 1951. After further training at Haramura, he was sent to Korea to join 3 RAR in late February. As a qualified signaller, he joined the battalion's signals platoon. By this time, the United States-led United Nations force had advanced into North Korea and had been driven back out again. Bolitho's arrival coincided with the end of the UN withdrawal and the start of the bite and hold operations to push Chinese and North Korean troops beyond the 38th parallel. Over the next 6 weeks, 3 RAR was involved in the advance. It took part in several actions, most notably the capture of the hills known as Salmon and Sardine towards the head of the Kapiong Valley. In the middle of April, the Australians were relieved and 3 RAR went into reserve near the village of Kapiong. A number of men were sent to Japan for leave, and Bolitho was attached to Alpha Company as Major Ben O'Dowd's signaller. The men began preparations for Anzac Day. These plans would never be completed. During the morning of the 23rd of April, O'Dowd was resting on the grass, enjoying the sunshine. He later recalled, "I lay stretched out on the grass, enjoying a carefree doze, when Harry Bolitho shattered my dreams with an urgent message. Companies were on half an hour's notice to move, and the orders group was to assemble at the village of Choktuni. The Chinese had launched a major offensive, smashing into the 6th Republic of Korea Army Division, holding the head of the Kapiong Valley, which had been forced to withdraw. The men of 3 RAR were sent to the hills and began preparing defences. They were not expecting to be there for more than a night. They were certainly not expecting to fight a major battle. But by late afternoon, the sounds of war drew even closer, and the stream of refugees had become a flood. Alpha Company, located on a forward spur, took the brunt of continuous Chinese assaults that began around 9:30 p.m. and continued into the early hours of the next morning. Each wave was preceded by a shower of hand grenades. It was probably during one of these grenade attacks that Bolitho suffered multiple shrapnel wounds to his head, arms and legs. By mid-morning, 3 RAR was surrounded, with no way to evacuate the wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson organised a column of US Sherman tanks to pick up the wounded. But the column of tanks was exposed to heavy continuous fire as it made its way to the Australian positions. Regimental Medical Officer Dr. Don Beard rode in one of the tanks to assist in the evacuation of the wounded. As the tanks did not have enough room for the wounded, the decision was made to strap as many men as possible to the rear decks. Beard and the tank crews were afraid that the Chinese would open fire on the tanks, but there was no other choice. When the tanks were loaded, they began the return journey down the valley. The Chinese held their fire, allowing the wounded to reach safety. The tanks made at least one more journey to retrieve 3 RAR's wounded and were shot at on the way, but the wounded were let pass. Bolitho was among those transported to 3 RAR's regimental aid post. From there, he was evacuated by soldiers from the Indian Field Ambulance to the nearby US Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, where he died from his wounds the following day. He was laid to rest in the United Nations Memorial Cemetery near Busan. He was 26 years old. During the afternoon of the 24th of April, 3 RAR was forced to withdraw from its positions, but the men made it to their brigade lines later that night. The battalion had suffered 32 men dead, 59 men wounded, and 3 men taken prisoner of war. Harold Bolitho's name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among the 340 Australians who died as a result of their service during the Korean War. A photograph of his headstone is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Harold Bolitho, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Catapult party, shoulders up.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Catapult party presents arms. Catapult party, shoulder up.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult party in words. Turn. Catapult party, quick, march.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you all for visiting the Australian War Memorial, and we wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.